Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the webinar. Today's topic is the impact of brain injury. Thank you for joining us today. These webinars are brought to you for free, and thanks to our sponsors, Cured Choices, Caring Companions at Home, O'Connor Mortuary, and of course, Alzheimer's Orange County. My name is Jasmine Victor. I am the Director of Education here at Alzheimer's Orange County, and I'll be your host today. Thank you again for joining us today. Again, we're covering the impact of brain injury. Our sponsors are providing these webinars to you as a service to the community on topics that are beneficial for anyone who cares for and works with older adults. We hope you find today's presentation informative and useful. Today's presenter is going to be Gregory Ayotte, excuse me. Before I introduce our presenter, though, I'd like to review what you need to know if you're interested in earning CEUs for today's webinar. All right, so today's presenter is Greg Ayotte is a Director of Consumer Services for the Brain Injury Association of America. He's worked for them since 1996 with a 3-year break in 2003. If you call their BIAA 800 number, he'll be the one answering your questions regarding brain injury. He's a certified brain injury specialist trainer and holds a bachelor's in psychology. Before his tenure at BIAA, he worked at CARF, Accredited Community Reentry Brain Injury Program in Maryland. He's presented about brain injury to local, regional, and national conferences. He's been active in the brain injury community for over 20 years. He was appointed to Maryland's TBI Advisory Board, which reports to the governor's office in Maryland. He participated with the Centers of Disease Control and Injury Prevention on a Brain Injury External Experts Committee regarding development of information and resource protocols and policies for brain injury organizations across the country. So thank you so much, Greg, for joining us. I'll hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So welcome everybody. Hopefully over the course of the next bit of time, we're going to talk a little bit about brain injury. Hopefully I can give some understanding about the definition, scope, causes, consequences, and a little bit about what a brain injury might look like and some tips and strategies for folks that may be working with folks with brain injury. And right off the bat, we're into a little bit of controversy already. You may have seen these different terminology used in regards to brain injury for these like acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injuries. Historically, the brain injury community is not consistent in how it uses its terminology. So an acquired brain injury is any injury to the brain that's not hereditary, congenital, degenerative, or induced by birth trauma. So it's any type of injury. What you may see is the acquired brain injury being used to describe really what's a non-traumatic injury. And we'll talk about those in just a second. So the kind of the two general categories of brain injury are the traumatic and non-traumatic. The traumatic brain injury is an injury to the brain from some external force. So that's like a motor vehicle accident or a fall or a blow to the head, some external force that is causing injury to the brain. The non-traumatic injury is an injury to the brain that doesn't require the physical force. So that would be things like a stroke or seizures or like a hypoxic injury, which is a lack of oxygen to the brain that is can cause a brain injury. So I just wanted to say, give some examples of some of the ways a brain injury can happen. As I said, the traumatic injury is some external force. So that could be a motor vehicle, falls, gunshot wounds, sports injuries, shaken baby, and the injuries from domestic violence is certainly something we have spent time kind of researching, and that it's often under or unreported injuries. And for the non-traumatic injuries, as I had mentioned earlier, the hypoxic injuries, like from lack of oxygen to the brain, like from a heart attack or something like that, that is also an area that is often underreported. We'll talk a little bit about the scope and about the underreporting. So if you look at the data for brain injury, really the the national data that's available is really for the traumatic brain injuries from car accidents, from falls, from blow to the head, something like that. That data is tracked fairly well from the Centers for Disease Control and Injury Prevention. And so the data shows us that we know there's at least 2.8 million traumatic brain injuries that happen each year. We know that traumatic brain injuries is a factor in third of all injury-related deaths in the U.S. That there's more than 61,000 deaths and 230,000 hospitalized. And so if you look at that data, so it's one of the things that someone had mentioned to me in a talk here, like, well, it's 2.8 million that happened, but only 230,000 are hospitalized. And you think about one, what it takes to be hospitalized, and two, really the majority of injuries are mild from a trauma standpoint, not a consequence standpoint. And just a note about the non-traumatic injuries. So the other types of injuries like the hypoxic injuries or neurotoxins or seizures, those we really don't have great national data on how often that happens. So there's a little bit of a mystery as to exactly how many brain injuries are happening in the US each year. If there's one thing I hope that folks walk away with, it's this: that injury severity does not equal outcome. The injury severity you might see using mild, moderate, severe is really, it was a tool to develop for first responders to communicate with trauma centers about the severity of that initial trauma. So I've talked to many people who have sustained what would be considered a mild injury, and were not able to go back to work or to school, and had a significant change in lifestyle as a result of a mild injury. Conversely, I've talked to a lot of folks who sustained a severe injury, went through a lot of rehabilitation and recovery, and were able to return to work or school or what have you. So the injury severity does not always equal outcome. So onto the kind of a little bit about the brain anatomy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to give folks an idea of a little bit about kind of what parts of the brain do what. So the brain itself, it is like a gelatinous mass. It ends up being about 3 pounds, and it's just sitting inside that cerebral spinal fluid, kind of inside the rough and bony skull. Quite an amazing organ. So we're going to talk a lot about this part of the brain. This is the frontal lobe part, this front part of the brain. That is the hub of activity. That's the part of the brain that is the part that plans and sequences, that monitors your own behavior, that takes the information from other parts of the brain, kind of puts it together, comes up with a plan, and sends that out to be executed. So when that frontal lobe is damaged or hurt or injured, it can impact many different areas of day-to-day life. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the other sections. So you certainly have, so this is a little bit of a generalization and simplification, but The idea that there are certain parts of the brain that kind of deal more with different functions. So there's certainly parts here, like behind the frontal lobe, deals a lot with movement. And then behind that is kind of touch and kind of where you are in space. That's that part of the brain. And then in the back here, this part that always fascinated me, you have all of this brain anatomy, brain real estate dedicated to just processing visual information. And so you have a lot of brain power being used just to process visual, which makes sense because we're primarily uh, visual creatures. So, and then over towards here on the side, which is called the temporal lobe, deals with things like processing memories from short term to long term with emotions, some personality stuff is in there, music, writing is all in there. And then underneath, kind of at the bottom, are kind of the purple part here. It's the cerebellum, and that deals with kind of coordination of movement. And then down here at the very kind of bottom is the brain stem, and that deals with what we call like the autonomic function. So that's things like breathing and heart rate, body temperature, reflexes, etc. So just a little bit of an overview of some of the things that can be impacted after a brain injury. Typically, you'd see it kind of categorized like this into physical, cognitive, and emotional, behavioral. This is not a complete list, but it's the idea of you can see obviously the scope of issues that can be impacted, everything from headache and swallowing and balance and vision to trouble with walking, fatigue, light and sound sensitivity, and a lot of the cognitive issues, which we'll talk more about, are obviously they're harder to see. You can't see these things when there's problems with attention or memory or judgment. Those things are harder to see how that actually happens and how it impacts. And then there's the emotional behavioral part too, where you can have things like irritability and aggression and folks being easily irritated or excessively anxious or impulsive. Those are all kind of common challenges after an injury. So you can see this whole range of behaviors and impacts of brain injury. And of course, some of the things are, some of the consequences of the injury are apparent. You can see these things. So like a hemiparesis or speech issues. So if you have, weakness in an arm and a leg, if you have speech issues or balance issues, or it's something like that, those things are apparent and you can see that, okay, well, this something must have happened. But often they will look fine. We hear this a lot from the folks who contact us. It's a struggle they have because they're out and they're walking and they're talking and everyone assumes they must be fine. But often it can take them longer than expected to respond to questions, or you might see them repeating themselves or tangential speech. And so, again, as they look fine, but in conversations, it can seem like something's not quite right. And add on to that, that very often after an injury, the person with the injury is still trying to figure out how this injury impacts me day to day. And that certainly can create a lot of stress and anxiety. And as we know, anyways, brain injury or no brain injury, when you're under higher levels of stress than normal, it's just harder to maintain attention and pay attention and remember things and problem solve. Your brain is not processing info as efficiently as it usually does, which can certainly impact your ability to make decisions or remember things or remember the importance of things. So we'll talk now about a little bit about the frontal lobe and kind of how it can impact folks and some what it might look like and some tips for folks who might come across this. So the frontal lobe is probably the most frequently injured part of the brain for a traumatic injury. You think about in a motor vehicle accident or a fall, like you're moving forward and you're stopping, and so that frontal lobe, that front part of the brain, is very often impacted. And so when it's impacted, it definitely can impact our ability to problem solve and kind of basically be able to read the room. So the frontal lobe is the part of the brain that helps us remember things from previous events and kind of take those lessons learned and apply them to new events. It's the part of the brain that is the filter. So it's the part of the brain that is trying to figure out, it keeps you from saying things you probably shouldn't say. When we get angry or upset, I'll have those moments of wanting to say something, but that frontal lobe part is saying, yeah, I wouldn't say that out loud. So that's that frontal lobe part. That's that filter saying, think about a different way to express what you're feeling. And so for someone with a brain injury, they may not have that capability. And so you'll often see them, making statements, kind of saying things before they're thinking about what they're saying. And the frontal lobe also, it's the part of the brain that helps us. The way I used to describe it to the families that I was working with is when the frontal lobes are working, it is kind of like sailing on a lake where you're looking at the environment, you're looking at the boat you're sailing, you're looking at the wind and other boats and where you want to get to, and you adapt and you plan your route based on all that information and kind of putting it all together, planning and executing that plan. And so after a brain injury, a person with an injury to the frontal lobe, I used to describe it as a train on the track, is there was not a lot of flexibility in thinking. It was, I've had this idea, this is what I'm doing, and I'm doing it, and there's not really any variation. So it's more like that train on a track where it's going in one direction, not a lot of options. Another factor in the frontal lobe, it's also the part of the brain that kind of synthesizes and integrates incoming information. So one of the things we would often see is for somebody who has a healthy brain, that there's a level of kind of cognitive reserve we have available. And so throughout the course of the day, we regulate that reserve so we're not getting too exhausted. The person with the brain injury is having greater demands, especially cognitive demands, as well as emotional demands, trying to kind of filter that information, filter those thoughts. It takes more cognitive energy to do it. And so the result is you have much less kind of cognitive energy in reserve. And the result is often what you'll see is a person with a brain injury, the symptoms might get worse as the day goes on. Sometimes I used to have a client that I worked with that worked really at a job that required him to really kind of pay attention for long periods of time. He worked really hard at recovering and getting back to work, but he would keep seeing by the end of the day, he would start to like the stutter and the speech issues became more apparent because he had used up that cognitive reserve. I'll just say for the client that I had just mentioned, one of the things we decided to do was just to modify his schedule about kind of when he did certain tasks, to do the high demand task early in the day, the lower demand tasks later in the day, to kind of lessen the impact of that fatigue as much. And of course, to try to modify his schedule a little bit, kind of giving him a few more breaks during the course of the day to help kind of rest the brain a bit. So the other factor, I think, in the frontal lobe part, as I said, it's kind of assessing situations and applying lessons learned to new situations. And that can be very challenging to someone who's sustained an injury, is that they have trouble processing and storing and doing something with new information. There was a client that I worked with that he worked at the motor vehicle office, and his job was to put the records into a digital format. So it was a very structured job. He was able to do it with a lot of support, and he had, like notes up on his desk saying what the steps were. We had support making sure he was on task, that his production rate was great. And he struggled with that job. He worked there part-time and he struggled with it. But this person, they drove to work, that they were living in the house they grew up in. It was 5 minutes from the motor vehicle's office. It was on the same road he used to drive to go to high school before his injury. So he had done that route, seen that office, been there from his house thousands and thousands of times. It was so overlearned, so intact, that even with the significant short-term memory issues, kind of dealing with new information, that intact knowledge is there, and was able to kind of drive to and from work. I mean, that was really the extent of his driving. But applying information to new situations was always the problem. The other issue is certainly kind of filtering out extra info. You think about if you're in a restaurant or a cafeteria or what have you, and you have a group of folks, you naturally filter out the conversation on this part of the table to focus your attention on this conversation, the other person. And that's something that we naturally do without really ever thinking about it. So the person with the brain injury may not be able to filter out that information as well. And so the result is they're kind of processing two conversations at the time. And very often it can get kind of a little overwhelming, and they can't filter out one enough to be able to listen to it. So in essence, they can participate in neither conversation. All right, so now kind of hopefully set the stage a little bit about kind of what it might look like after brain injury, especially to the frontal lobe. And so we get a lot of calls from families that are struggling with this after the injury, that the person with the injury is impulsive and they get angry easily, and the family feels like they're walking on eggshells, and it doesn't matter what they say, the person will get angry. And of course, a lot of our time spent is one validating what they're saying, what they're experiencing. I'm like, yeah, that definitely happened. And it's stressful. It's stressful for the family. Even when you understand that it's an injury, it is still stressful to deal with. So some of the tips and the strategies that we share with families is dealing with folks who have those issues with impulsivity and judgment, and kind of not quite seeing how their behaviors affect others, is one, good family education, understanding this is a physical injury to the brain that is impacting their ability to kind of filter out some of the things they say. So I always tell the families, don't take it personal. That's easy to say, hard to do, but trying not to take it personal. And we try to work with families what we call keep the problem in the middle. Is the person with the injury they might have a problem or a question, but they're spilling all this other emotion with it. And if you can move past the emotion part and say, okay, well, the problem seems to be that you can't get a ride to your appointment, and that is really kind of stressing you out. So if you try to focus and keep the problem in the middle, that increases your chances of being able to have a more productive conversation with the person. And certainly repetition, redirection, and calm are going to be three of your best tools in your toolbox. Um, it is natural, especially when it's a family member that's getting agitated. It's natural to want to like meet their emotion, right? They're getting mad, they're yelling at you, they're telling you you're worthless. It's very easy to jump in that and be like, well, let me tell you all the things that you've done that's impacted me. And if you jump into that and meet their emotion, all that's doing is it's adding kerosene to the fire. It's just going to build on that. And so if you can remain calm, keep the problem in the middle, there's more of a chance of kind of getting the person more redirected to actually solving their problem or answering their question rather than getting wrapped up in the emotion. And then this idea of the environment drives behavior. This is something that was drilled into me when I first started working in brain injury is the person with the injury, when they are acting emotional and irrational and impulsive, that is part of the injury. And there you're not going to be able to stop them from doing that. Like you're not going to stop that from happening. But that environment you create, that environment you create around the person is one of the bigger factors in some of the behaviors that you see. So if you're always trying to be calm and trying to problem solve, it's it doesn't keep it from happening, but it lessens the number of times that those kind of outbursts, the angry outbursts can happen. So that environment drives the behavior. Because a person with the injury, I said, their inability, that filter part of the frontal lobe that kind of filters that emotional component does not work very well. And so they're much more often are reacting emotionally rather than kind of thinking about problem solving. And so the more you can kind of create the environment to help them just think through a problem, the more likely you are to be able to kind of walk past the emotional part and get to the problem solving. Does it work every time? No, it does not. But certainly it works better than yelling. So the art of this is the tone of voice. Um, there was we had an intern, this was years ago. We had an intern that she had a very aggressive tone of voice. It's her natural tone of voice, sounded very aggressive. And so she would get in a lot of arguments on the phone with folks as she was talking to folks. Um, and what we taught her was, your tone of voice is too aggressive for the folks you're working with. And so you have to practice. It is a skill. It's something you have to practice at kind of being able to give simple messages and try to slow down the rate of speech just a little, not so much that if you do it too slow, if you talk too slow, they think, oh, what do you think? I'm stupid. So it's that art of being able to uh, share information or ask questions to get information in a tone of voice that is calm, giving simple messages, asking simple questions, and then giving them extra time to process. The intern that I had mentioned, that was the other part that she would do, is that she would have this aggressive tone and not wait long enough for the person to answer. And so it can feel weird a little where you're kind of asking this question and you just have to sit in silence for a few seconds. It's not always a normal feeling for our conversation. And so you have to give them a little bit of time to process the info and then maybe repeat the question or see if they need more information. But the other art of all of this is we had a person who would call us from time to time, and they would get themselves all worked up over family issues or what have you, like a family reunion was happening and he was all upset that people were going to be, asking why wasn't he working and what's he doing. And so he would start getting himself worked up and he'd start working off of on these tangents about things that happened in the past with the family or things that he wanted to do for work in the future. And so he'd be all over the place. And so there's not a, when the person's getting that revved up, you'll notice that there's not that regular break in conversation. So in typical conversation, somebody's saying, even if they're angry, they're saying something, there's a natural break where they want you to interject or ask a question or share your opinion or validate what they're saying. And so for the person with the injury, they're just spilling information. And so it can feel rude, but I would say if they're getting tangential, don't be afraid to interrupt, kind of jump in. You don't have to yell. You can still interrupt and not be rude about it, but then just trying to get them back to the question at hand, the topic at hand. The other issue is often, as we mentioned before, for that conversation, like in the cafeteria, or if there's too many distractions, uh, television or radio's on, or a phone going off, or playing something, those things can really distract the person with the injury from being able to maintain attention on the conversation or listen to what the questions are. So if you're going to have a conversation or if you seem like they're not listening to what you're saying, you can certainly try to reduce distractions, television, radio, phone, whatever it might be. Make sure you have their attention before you start talking. That's not a, hey, look at me, I'm talking to you. It's not that. It's the, I have a question for you. Hey, I've got a question for you. So it's that kind of repeating the question calmly, trying to make sure, seeing that they're turning toward you, like, okay, all right, I think they're paying attention now. Okay. And then, like I said, speaking slow, simple, clear, trying to stay calm can make a big difference in kind of minimizing how often the outburst might happen. The other part of that is, so we're talking about our role, like being able to stay calm and ask questions. It's also giving them the time to formulate the response. It happens all the time when I'm talking to folks on the phone, or I might ask them some questions about maybe like the treatment they received or question, things they're looking for. And you can tell that they're kind of fuddling around, like it can't find the words. They're not quite sure what they want to say. Sometimes they're apologetic. They'll say, oh, I'm really sorry. I'm very flustered. My response is, it's okay. Take your time. Think about what you want to say. And often something as simple as that can help with um, allowing them the time to kind of formulate the thought, get their question out. Additionally, if we know that if you have an important conversation or an emotional conversation that you want to have with a family member, a loved one, or whoever you're working with, be mindful of what they've been through that day. Be mindful of, so we talk about allow for respirator, reduce stimulation. It's also, don't ask, what are you doing with your life at the end of the day when they've just done, 5 hours of testing or what have you? Like, try to think about, what's their cognitive reserve level right now? And do they have enough in the tank to be able to answer more complicated questions, or is this a question to wait for another time? All right. So some of the takeaways, and then I'll share some resources that I hope will be helpful as well. That this brain injury is much more common than we think. It happens much more often than we think. Very often we can't see the injury. It is just from my experience working on our helpline that it's most problematic with kind of problem solving and relationships. So the folks, this it reminds me, I just was on a call earlier this morning, and the person with the injury was sharing that they got really frustrated calling places, like calling independent living centers or voc rehab or whatever it might be, trying to get help. But the problem was he was kind of sharing his whole story. Like he would just, when he got on the phone with someone, he would just tell his story from the day of the injury to now. And he was injured, 2.5 years ago. So there's a there's a long story. I'm like, you got to think about what the person on the other end of the phone needs to know to help you. That's that problem solving. It's the not thinking about how your behaviors might impact others, not thinking about what do I need to do to get my questions answered or my needs met. And then I always tell folks that brain injury doesn't happen in a bubble. And you saw earlier we talked about some of the emotional components that can happen. So you can have depression, anxiety, etc. And the depression and anxiety can certainly be a result of the brain injury, but it also can be a result of the consequence of the injury. So if you're somebody who is, working full time and, had a nice house and a nice car, and then you get an injury and you can't work, and you might lose the house and you don't know if you could drive and you're not sure if you can get back to work, it would stand to reason that you might end up being depressed if you're not sure of what the outcome is. That's what I mean. A brain injury doesn't happen in a bubble. So sometimes the emotional components can be a result of the injury, but it also can be a result of kind of the impact of the injury as well. All right. So I would say that, if there's more, if there's questions, if you're ever looking for information about brain injury, we have information on a wide range of topics or issues that can happen after an injury. You can contact us through our 800 line. We also have resources available on our website. So there's our challenge newsletter. So each newsletter is a different topic or issue. We have these Butch Altman Survivor webinars. Those are webinars by survivors for survivors, more very practical information. And then we also have a caregiver information center that has a range of articles and webinars and resources for caregivers. So that's our 800 number. So yeah, you would talk to me or Heather. Heather's our other certified brain injury specialist who works with me on the helpline. So hopefully you can get these slides. So I put the links in to be able to find these things on our website. So there's the link to the Challenge magazine, link to the Ultimate webinars. There are these fantastic brain injury fact sheets through the Model Systems. They're a group of brain injury research centers that collaborate on brain injury research and developing materials that are kind of written more for survivors and families. They're fantastic. We have a fledgling YouTube channel where you can see shorter interviews with survivors, with professionals on a range of topics. And again, the link to the Caregiver Resource Center. And then in California, California has these regional brain injury resource centers, and they can be a great resource for identifying support groups, local services and supports they can definitely be a good resource to connect with. That's it. That's all I have to say. If any questions?
Thanks, Greg. Actually, I'm going to go over a few reminders here for our CEU credit people. We want to remind everyone the importance of being aware of implicit biases or unconscious stereotypes as we care for others. Best practice is a person-centered approach where we view each person that we care for as an individual with unique needs and preferences to treat them with dignity and respect, even when they are very different from ourselves. If we always listen carefully and respectfully so that we understand their perspectives, values, and preferences, we can build trust and provide the highest quality of care. So if you have any questions for the presenter, please type them now into the chat box. But before we begin the Q&A session, I just want to say it is 12:16. If we do run past 12:30, you're welcome to remain online to ask your question or listen to the answers. But if you need to leave the webinar, you can. Just remember that if you want to earn those credits, you need to be on for the full 60 minutes. So I want to, again, thank our sponsors. If you could go over to the next slide there. Greg, thank you. So our sponsors again were O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choices, Hospice and Palliative Services, Companions, Caring Companions at Home in Alzheimer's Orange County. Our next month's webinar is going to be on October 10th. And it's going to be on the topic of understanding hospice and palliative care with Dr. Wynn. So now we have our questions. And I was trying to find a few here. I just want to make sure that there was a couple in the beginning. I don't want to miss anybody. So I think there was a question about a stroke, if that is considered a brain injury.
Is a stroke considered a brain injury?
Correct.
Yes, yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Are some types of dementia considered a brain injury? Good question.
No, most dementias are considered progressive. So I would say not. So typically a brain injury would be something that's not progressive or degenerative.
Okay. That's a good question because I was just thinking about vascular vascular
Yep.
dementia, but yeah, it is unless I think there's treatments and things like the same thing with that stroke. So
Yeah.
good question. Let's see. What helps a person with TBI when the symptoms last more than 2 years?
Good patient education. So help understanding the injury, talking to others who have sustained an injury, talking to others who get it when it comes to kind of living with the consequences of an injury can be really helpful. Not only just not feeling so isolated, but also, I mean, we found often that kind of talking to others who have kind of been where you're at can help kind of formulate a path. Like it's very common, after an injury where you might get your care initially, you go through rehab, and then you go home and they say, hey, good luck. And you're kind of left to kind of figure out what the next steps might be. And so connecting with others who have kind of been where you're at to help figure out what are some things you can do to help yourself, not feel so isolated can make a big difference. And then also just having a conversation with your primary care doc about some of the things that can impact kind of recovery after injury. And also creating the best possible environment just for the healthy brain in general. All the things we know we should do become more important for somebody recovering from an injury. So good hydration, good nutrition, rest, some type of exercise, whatever you can do without exacerbating symptoms. All of those things become important parts of recovery.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Can you speak to the risk of brain injury from sports such as soccer and other sports?
No, only so. It, I say that only because there's some data out there, but there's a little bit on NCAA athletes. There's some smaller studies on high school athletes. One thing we know is the risk is greater than I think folks realized. And it's the importance of having a good concussion management program. So identifying the concussion, resting, don't go back to play, all the things we kind of have learned now make a big difference. But I don't know the data well enough, like how often it happens, to be able to speak to it with any authority.
Okay. Well, thank you. Here's another question. In the example you gave of the person who's sharing excess information while calling others for help, you suggested to the person about only sharing what the receiver needed to hear. After receiving this feedback, how likely is it that a person will actually learn and remember this for future interactions?
It depends. So, I mean, I've had that same conversation with them over several years and it hasn't changed significantly. Like they'll remember it for the next call and then it'll go back to regular. And I've also had folks who the light bulb went off. They were like, "Oh, I get it." And so, I mean, that's I think what families are looking for are, how do I make that light bulb go off? I'm like, there's no magic phrase. It's planting seeds. It's giving feedback. It's being supported. It's getting information. It's just repetition, creating an environment that's more likely to happen. So there's no, magic formula. I do know that if we're not giving that feedback, it's not going to happen. I know that much. So I would say, yeah, if folks are giving that feedback and don't see change, which is the other part we get. If you're not seeing the change in behaviors or they're, excessive, um, it helps to get the feedback from multiple places. So it's not just the family giving feedback. It might be an employer, a friend, a doctor, whoever else it might be. The same message, but different messengers can make a big difference as well. So that's the other part that I always tell us, whoever else you can get to kind of reinforce the feedback can also make a difference in kind of helping the person understand.
Okay. Uh, let's see. Were you saying at the end of your talk that stress, etc., can cause a brain injury?
No, but it can exacerbate. So if you've had like an injury and you're under a high levels of stress for an extended period of time, you will definitely see an exacerbation of symptoms. So
Okay.
I would say that's more, yeah, something else has to happen. But the stress itself won't cause an injury, but it will definitely exacerbate stuff that's there.
Okay. Is a subdural hematoma a TBI?
Yes.
And poisoning or any toxicities?
Yes.
Okay. And Epstein-Barr viral infection be considered a brain injury?
Yes.
A lot of these kind of questions here.
Good questions.
Let's see about, can you speak a little bit more about individuals who have DM and insulin shock?
So that we had a call about that just last month. And so it's kind of like a hypoxic injury. So hypoxic injury, like reduce oxygen to the brain. And so it impacts the entire brain, which is the same for the DM and insulin. So it definitely impacts the entire brain. So it can look a little different in that folks with a hypoxic injury tend to have more short-term memory problems. Um, and it takes longer to recover. So I'd say so. It's yeah, but that can definitely cause an injury.
Okay. Um, there was a question about, I guess, TBI studies or maybe some physicians that evaluate brain injury. Um, if you're aware of any. Um,
No word, like brain injury studies. Is that what they were asking?
yeah, TBI studies. Yeah.
So there's an article on our website that talks about research in brain injury, kind of gives some resources. I'd encourage folks to go find that article. It's in our frequently asked questions section. You can obviously contact me. Probably the best place to, if you're looking for like clinical research, probably the best place to start is the clinicaltrials.gov website, where it's probably the largest database of clinical research. It's not specific to brain injury, so you'd have to think about the search terms you use, but that's one place that I know folks start when they're looking for what clinical research is out there.
A couple of questions regarding, I guess, improvement. If you have a TBI, or there was another question regarding frontal lobe damage, if there's a treatment or a bounce back. Some people have been able to bounce back with a TBI. Is there an extent of recovery limited to 1 or 2 years, or is there a bounce back period, various degrees? Can you touch on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, um, back in the day when I first started in brain injury, the rule of thumb was you get the bulk of the recovery in the first year. You're going to stop recovery by the second year, and that's going to be it. And that's it. And we've learned so much more about neuroplasticity and how dynamic the brain is versus how static we used to think it was, that you can have continued recovery years after an injury. So it's, if you're practicing cognitive skills, um, over time, you're going to have improvement. So whether that happens a year or 5 years post injury, yeah. So the window for recovery is much greater. We don't know is, I mean, there are certainly folks that I've talked to that are 10 years post and they're not getting better. Like this is what they are. I don't know why that person's not getting better, and yet somebody else who's 10 years post is now able to go back to work. Like that's the part we don't understand. Like why is one recovering more, that we don't understand that fully yet. But the window for recovery is much greater than what we thought.
Okay. Well, thank you for your answer on that. There is a couple questions here regarding, again, the dementia and the link with TBI. Is there a higher risk developing a form of dementia years following a TBI?
Yes. So the more recent research into like the long-term issues after brain injury, it would seem like brain injury becomes a risk factor in things like vascular dementia and Parkinson's, seizures, even years post-injury. One of the I'm trying to remember where I think it's in, I can't remember where it was. It's somewhere on our site. It's a conversation I had with our previous medical director about that particular issue, about aging and brain injury and some of the risks involved in it. So yeah, there's it doesn't mean it's gonna happen, but it means that having a brain injury becomes a risk factor for it. So again, it's one of those where all the things we know we should do become more important for someone with an injury as a way to kind of mitigate the risks a little.
Okay. A couple questions about symptoms. Um, One was ringing in the ears. Is that common?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
the tinnitus after, yes.
Any ways of stopping that ringing?
No, I tell you, I
And
have that too. I have ringing in the ears as well from too many years of being around loud equipment. And yeah, there's not really a great tool for it yet.
Okay. And are headaches common with TBI?
Yes, very common. It's probably one of the more common symptoms. Yeah.
Right. Um, this sounds like maybe a helpline question, but I have a client who sustained cervical fracture due to MVA as a child. And as an adult, he is angry and inappropriate. I am thinking he had TBI at that time. Does it sound likely? Not asking for a diagnosis, but does that sound kind of like a possibility?
Yes, certainly a possibility. Certainly worth a conversation with a medical professional to kind of look at the history and treatment. And yeah,
Okay. Let's see. Oh, can brain injury cause schizophrenia, psychosis, or other symptoms that may appear to be related to mental illness?
it is rare for that to occur. Um, Often, what we see is the person with the brain injury is diagnosed is schizoaffective, but they're not. It's a brain injury, and the clinician is not familiar enough with brain injury and what it might look like. So, like a true kind of someone who is schizophrenic or by significant mental illness after an injury is rare. It does happen, but it's rare.
Okay. All right. Well, that was all the questions I see, and that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. Thanks so much, Greg, and thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. That was great.
Excellent. Thank you.
And please watch for that survey. It will begin immediately as you exit the webinar. And again, it will be emailed to you 24 hours if you did not get that survey. Watch for a flyer for the next webinar on October 10th. Feel free to forward it on to anyone else who might be interested. Don't forget, you can visit our website, alzoc.org, to learn more about our education programs and webinars and to view recordings of past webinars. This is also recorded and posted within a week. Again, though, no CE credit will be earned from viewing recordings. It has to be live. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.